So was it then kind of cigar-shaped as these tip tanks are?
More egg-shaped than anything.
A farmer in Newark Valley, New York, saw two occupants in an egg-shaped craft. But they didn't fly off the second they saw Mr. Wilcox. In fact, according to him, he spent 2 hours conversing with these Martians.
So several years ago, my two closest friends and I were out in the driveway, lying down, stargazing, and we all noticed a deep black rectangular something moving across the sky steadily at a fairly low altitude. It was either low altitude or it was an incredibly large object. It emitted no sound, no light, and we could all clearly tell that it was blocking out the starlight from behind it. All these years later, we describe it affectionately as the flying refrigerator.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Debriefed. My name is Chris Ramsey, and today we're going to be taking a look at a case that happened on April 24th, 1964. Now, if you Googled that date and typed UFO beside it, you would probably come up with the case of Lonnie Zamora, the police officer who chased down a UFO in Socorro, New Mexico.
Instantly, Socorro was the center of an unprecedented media frenzy.
This is one of the few sightings that got national attention immediately. Lonnie Zamora's story is on the national news. It's in all the newspapers. Everybody's talking about it.
The police officer, the occupants retracted back into the vehicle, and then the rocket sort of shot up into space over Lonnie's head. But no, folks, that is not the case that we are going to be looking into. The case that I propose is one of Gary Wilcox, a farmer in Newark Valley, New York, who on the same day, just a few hours prior, saw two occupants in an egg-shaped craft. But they didn't fly off the second they saw Mr. Wilcox. In fact, according to him, he spent 2 hours conversing with these Martians. So folks, that's what we're going to be looking into today. I am very excited about reading through this. This read-through is courtesy of the Flying Saucer Review magazine. We'll be reading from an excerpt from said magazine today. The reason I wanted to cover this is because it doesn't only cover Gary's encounter with the beings and the saucer, but it also covers some of the sort of psychological evaluation that Gary went through and the psychiatric study into the examination of Gary Wilcox in his home, which I think is a pertinent piece of information if we're going to talk about a sort of, I promise, I swear, trust me, bro, this happened. I think the least we can do is verify the veracity and the psychological evaluation of this individual, which is what we're going to do through this here article written by Berthold E. Schwarz. There was a telephone call interview done just a short while after with Mr. Wilcox, and I'll leave the link to that below. Here's a snippet.
So was it then kind of cigar-shaped as these tip tanks are?
More egg-shaped than anything. It was about 20 foot long, 15 or 16 foot wide, and about 4 foot deep.
So in this article, we also go through the interview held by Priscilla Baldwin, a former neighbor of Gary Wilcox. She was 37 years old at the time, and her occupations and background, given UFO literature, include she was a legal secretary and also a radar technician during World War II. Now, as soon as this happened to Gary Wilcox, he was told by the alien beings, by the way, not to spill the beans and not to talk to anyone about this, but being, a salt-of-the-earth sort of farm boy, he came home and told his mother. Didn't explicitly tell her not to tell anyone, and then she ended up spilling the beans, which reached the ears of Miss Baldwin here, who eventually supplied crucial information about Wilcox's story. Went to go see the neighbors and friends. She contacted all these people. She recorded a set of notes on April 28th with a Q&A, which we'll be going through. She accompanied Wilcox to the site on April 29th, for which we have a photo of, the alleged landing site. And she also ended up contacting the Tioga Sheriff County's office, lending her notes to Officer George Williams, who incorporated them into the official investigation. Now, there are certain rumors out there that Miss Priscilla Baldwin may have had a little bit of a previous relationship with UFOs, given that she was a radar technician during World War II. She had technical familiarity, and because she knew Wilcox and considered him trustworthy, she was motivated to help. Perhaps maybe she had her own sighting during that time, working the radars. Who knows? So by no means was she an official UFO buff or researcher, but she knew that Gary Wilcox was credible. He was like just a salt-of-the-earth guy. Just, you can trust him. He's a farmer, not out to really gain any notoriety or fame. And so she thought this was very interesting and obviously worthy of her time to investigate it. So let's get into this article now. Gary Wilcox and the UFOnauts. We begin. Psychiatric study of witnesses to close-range UFO sightings is useful in establishing the reliability of the witness, in obtaining data of medical significance, and in understanding the event. Unfortunately, all of the episodes involving possible UFO occupants, there are very few published studies by physicians, the writings in the popular press, and, in particular, the detailed documented accounts by Charles Bowen and the provocative data collected by John A. Keel raise many questions in the answering of which psychiatric techniques might have value. Such problems as psychosis versus health, paranoid state versus the alleged reality of bizarre quote-unquote men in black, persecutions such paranormal phenomena as prophecy, hauntings, telekinesis, and sightings of supposed monsters have come to light. Naturally, I think this is a perfect place to be a little skeptical is when we're talking about aliens. And so I think it merits its own investigation into the psychological prowess of these individuals and witnesses. The author first learned of the extraordinary experience of Gary Wilcox in Newark Valley, New York, while studying many UFO sightings in the vicinity of Towanda, Pennsylvania. His informant, Miss Aileen Isbell of Luther's Mills, whom he had studied and found trustworthy, mentioned her brother-in-law, Arthur Frederick, Jr., who formerly rented an apartment next to Gary Wilcox's farm. Mr. Frederick, a computer programmer who had worked on the Apollo simulator project, vouchsafed, that's an interesting word, vouchsafed, I'm going to use that from now on, for Mr. Wilcox's veracity. The author then recalled Olga Hotchkiss's story of the Wilcox experience and also paperback reports which at the time seemed rather far-fetched and which might have been based on Binghamton, New York newspaper accounts. After the author had studied Mrs. Isbell, however, the Gary Wilcox UFO encounter seemed most intriguing. Therefore, on October 18, 1968, Gary Wilcox was psychiatrically examined in his home. His wife was also interviewed. These studies were supplemented by several telephone interviews with the Wilcoxes and face-to-face interviews with Mr. Wilcox's younger brother Floyd of Newark Valley and Sheriff Paul J. Taylor of Tioga County, Owego, New York. Mr. Wilcox's mother and his second oldest brother Barry were questioned on the telephone. A neighboring farmer and steelworker, Vic Kobilars, whose daughter was a schoolmate of Gary Wilcox, was also interviewed on the telephone and through letters. Mr. Kobilars is a relative by marriage of Miss Teresa Krajewski and also an uncle of her closest lifelong friend. Mr. Krajewski is a close friend of the author. Mr. Kobilars talked with Gary Wilcox shortly after the UFO event. Mrs. Winifred Martz, Monroeton, Pennsylvania, mother of the author's EEG technician, Mrs. Evelyn Goldner, also contacted one of her close friends, Mrs. Pauline Beale. There are so many names here. I don't expect anyone, including myself, to remember any of these names. I think this is just to provide a bit of thoroughness. I think we can forego the reading of more names unless you're taking notes. I'll link to this article, by the way. But most importantly, Miss Priscilla J. Baldwin, a former neighbor of Gary Wilcox, who is a legal secretary and who was a radar technician during World War II, kindly supplied much crucial information through correspondence and on the telephone. She contacted friends of neighbors of Gary Wilcox, Mrs. Helen McPherson and Walter Stevens, who supplied additional information. It was due to Miss Baldwin's initiative that this extraordinary case came to the attention of Binghamton, New York newspapers, and to Sheriff Paul J. Taylor of Tioga County, New York. Miss Baldwin's role. Here we go. The following notes were recorded by Miss Baldwin, age 37, on April 28, 1964, after talking with Gary Wilcox, age 26, about the spaceship that landed in his property on April 24, 1964. Open quote. Some questions and answers I received. Question. When did you notice object? Answer. About 10 a.m. I was spreading manure in lower field above my house and barn. Noticed a white or shiny object above the field, just on inside edge of woods. These are obviously abbreviated notes. I feel like there are some words being omitted, probably in the context of jotting them down quickly. I was curious and drove the tractor and manure spreader up to the edge of the woods and stopped. Got a closer look at the object and thought it to be a fuselage or fuel tank from a plane. That's interesting. Question, what did you do? Answer, I thumped it and kicked it. Felt like a metallic canvas. So cool. Might be the only person in history to thump and kick a UFO. Question, then what? Answer, 2 men appeared from under the object. These men were holding what seemed to be a metal tray approximately 1 foot square, filled with alfalfa, with roots and soil, leaves and brush. The men were attired in what seemed to be white or some kind of metallic suits, with no part of their body showing. So the difference here between the Lonnie Zamora case and the Wilcox case is, first of all, the craft, although appeared to have the same texture. The one in the Lonnie Zamora case also had a symbol on it, some type of like alien symbol. Who knows? Maybe this was on the other side of the craft and Mr. Wilcox couldn't see it. But secondly, the beings, although I think we're going to get into maybe at least describing them a bit, were the same height, but the ones in the Zamora case wore overalls. All right, so maybe they got changed. They were no longer in their farm suits. I don't know. Question, were you frightened? Answer, I sure was. I didn't say much for the first few minutes, but thought it was some kind of a trick being pulled on me. Question, what were the first words spoken? Answer, they said, do not be alarmed. They asked what I was doing, what the tractor, manure spreader, and manure was. I told them I was spreading manure. I talked and answered their questions for 2 hours and learned they had been watching me for quite a while. They were very interested in organic substances such as soil, as Mars is made up of rocky substances not fit for growing. Was told that in the future, Mars and Earth will be trading environments due to the rockets, missiles, and miscellaneous objects being ejected into space from Earth. Now, folks, I'll be honest, this is where I get a little bit skeptical. Not necessarily skeptical of Mr. Wilcox, perhaps he is telling the truth, but skeptical of the information being passed to him. Perhaps he's being psyoped by these aliens early on, but they say they're from Mars, all right? Now, back then, there was a bit of a, we're coming out of the sort of Space Brothers era where all these human-looking aliens said that they were from Venus, the Venusian aliens, and now we've transitioned into Martians, So maybe, who knows? Maybe these aliens caught wind of our sci-fi movies. That's the first thing. The second thing here is that there is a bit of a discrepancy between what was said, or how it was said, rather. In the early accounts, I do believe that he says, even in the interview, that the beings spoke to him using words. And then I think the second time, a little later on, the communication that was had was had telepathically. And so, bit of a major difference there. But let's read on just to make sure we got all the facts straight here. Did I mention to suspend your disbelief? Might be a good time right about now. Check it at the door. We'll get back to it in a second. It'll be there safe and sound upon your return. I promise you don't have to believe anything I say at all. Zero. You don't have to not believe. You can just live in some weird suspension while we continue to read through this document. It's interesting here because they say do not be alarmed, but then I think in the phone interview, if I'm not mistaken, they follow that up by saying we've spoken to humans before and then proceed to tell them they're from Mars. I asked them if I could go back with them. Was told I could not due to the thinness of atmosphere. They also said it was impossible for them to land in congested areas. The fumes of traffic were too dense. They also mentioned that astronauts Glenn and Grissom and the 2 astronauts from Russia would die within a year due to exposure of space. They seemed interested in learning the art of farming and growing. After learning that fertilizer would enrich this art, they wanted to know more about it. They did not seem to know what cows were either. They said they usually did not appear after dark, as their metallic ship would be too obvious. It made a swishing noise only, and in daylight, the ship is not easily observed. I watched them take off, and after being advised not to mention the incident, after a burring and swishing sound, they disappeared to the north. Only marks remaining that I could detect were a kind of red dust, evidently from propulsion, where the vehicle rested. I could not tell if it actually was resting on the ground or whether it was hovering in midair. It seemed to be larger than an auto, approximately 20 feet long and 14 feet wide, and shaped like an egg. The voices seemed to come from what might be the chest of the men, and they had an eerie sound. Okay, so this is interesting. Now we're talking about somebody trying to describe potentially what telepathy would be. You know, if you're hearing it in your head, you're assuming it's coming from somewhere. And so maybe it was coming from their chest. That's a really interesting detail. Secondly, I will say, did astronauts Glenn and Grissom die within a year? I don't think they did. Let me check. In his encounter, he claims that astronauts Glenn and Grissom and 2 other astronauts from Russia would die within a year due to exposure of space. Is any of that true or verifiable?
So that particular claim is definitely part of the more sensationalized side of the Wilcox story. There isn't any real evidence that Gary Wilcox's prediction about astronauts like John Glenn and Gus Grissom and unnamed Russian cosmonauts dying within a year actually came true or has any basis in fact. In reality, while Gus Grissom tragically died in the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, John Glenn lived for many decades after his space flights and even returned to space in the 1990s. The idea that Wilcox predicted multiple astronauts' deaths due to exposure of space is one of those...
All right, so full of crap are these aliens, or full of crap is this guy, Gary Wilcox? Again, I ask, why would you just lie about this? Now, I shall give my thoughts on what I think is going on here at the end of the video. Stay tuned for that. But for now, let's continue suspending our disbelief. Later that same afternoon, I returned to the spot where this took place. I left a 75-pound bag of fertilizer near a small tree. On returning to the scene, Saturday morning, April 25th, 1964, I found the fertilizer was gone. And that is the end of personal talk with Gary. On April 29, 1964, I went up to Gary's and asked if he would take me to the spot on his tractor. After finishing his afternoon chores, he took me up, in the rain, on the back of his tractor, and he also spread some fertilizer on the way. I had a camera with me and took a couple of shots. With the rainy weather, it was doubtful if they are good. I also picked up some rocks and leaves that were lying where the red dust had accumulated. So there's a photo 1. However, after the rain, there was no evidence of dust. That same day, on my return home, I contacted Sheriff Paul Taylor by telephone and told him of this incident. He had not heard of it before. He said he could not come to Newark Valley that day, but would when there was time. After not hearing if the sheriff had been up or not, I made another call to his office Friday, May 1st, 1964. I was informed he had not, but would soon. About 1.5 hours later, an officer from the sheriff's office, George Williams, drove in my driveway. He asked if I was the one that made the complaint to his office. I said yes. I asked him if he had been up to Gary's farm, and he said he had, but found no one there. I told him I thought he would be doing chores at that time, and I offered to go back up with him, which I did. We found Gary in the barn, and after the officer questioned him for a short time, he, the officer, wanted to go up to the place where the incident occurred. Gary did not want to interrupt his chores, but said I could show him the exact place. I agreed to go with him, and after trying the hill with the sheriff's car, decided to walk, as the ground was very muddy. We walked up and I showed him just what Gary had shown me and pointed out where the red dust had been and also where he had left the fertilizer. After inspecting the surrounding areas, we came back down. The officer asked me if I thought Gary would be willing to come to the sheriff's office to make a statement, and I told him I thought he would. On returning to the barn, the officer entered the barn again and asked Gary if he would. Gary agreed to be at the office in Owego at 7 p.m. that night. I think it's pretty funny that Gary just saw a UFO, spoke telepathically to strange beings from Mars, and, wasn't motivated enough to go and show the sheriff where it had happened. He's like, I said the story twice already. I'm good. I got chores to get back to. I don't know if that vouches for his credibility or if it plays against him in this case. Being an unbothered farm guy like he is, that kind of would fit, his character. Of just kind of being like, well, that's what happened. I went there and that's what it was. Now, if you don't mind, I got to get back to doing my chores. On bringing me back to my home, the officer questioned my being so interested in this. I told him that Gary had told several people, but like the majority, very few believed his story, and he was going to do nothing further about it. I asked him prior to my telephone call to the sheriff if he cared if I did. He said he didn't, and that he would just tell them the same he had everyone else. I told the officer I had written down notes after I'd talked to Gary the first time. The officer took these notes with him, and he said he would return them to me after talking to Gary. They evidently were used in cross-checking his story. Thursday night, May 7th, 1964, I stopped at the sheriff's office with a friend and picked up my notes. They had been retained in a sealed envelope. Signed, P.J. Baldwin. So on November 24th, 1968, Miss Baldwin wrote the author and enclosed newspaper clippings of the event. She also sent some very brittle leaves and a piece of stone that I picked up at the scene of the UFO landing. You are welcome to them if they could be of any significance. It was raining the day I rode up the hill with Gary on his tractor. The leaves and stones were wet. I picked them up right on the spot where the red dust was supposed to be. After I'd been on the hill, I did read that samples had been taken on the spot for researches, so I always thought the samples I had taken were of more value, seeing I had been at the scene before anyone else had. I'm also enclosing 2 very dim pictures taken that day I was there. You may not be able to decipher same, but the one picture does show broken branches on the trees where this object appeared, see Figure 1. Miss Baldwin continued, I've known Gary since he was a boy, and knowing what a quiet, shy fellow he has always been, I have never had any doubts as to what he saw. There are people who would revel in causing this kind of excitement, but I truly believe Gary would have been the last person who would have wanted this type of notoriety. I was in the Air Force for 3 years, and my career field was AC and W, radar. In my work, I plotted UFO blips, as they were called at the time, on the radar screen in the control center. Many times, blips were not identified. The speed in most cases was unbelievable. However, I don't know if any of that was ever the reason for my interest or not, but I do believe it had a lot to do with it. So there we go. We answered the question of, where this curiosity comes from. I think some of it might have, how could you be a radar operator, get a UFO blip, as she put it, and not be interested? For sure. Also, this reminds me a lot of Joe Simonton's account just 3 years prior. Joe Simonton, the famous man who was given pancakes by aliens, all right, and then ate one, and then gave the others to the Air Force, became a Project Blue Book investigation. This, by the way, was not investigated by Project Blue Book. I suspect they had their hands full with the Lonnie Zamora case, which happened on the same day. It just kind of flew under the radar. Unlucky if he was trying to get this out to the national press. Being overshadowed by a similar event. Oh, this is interesting. So there's an asterisk here. He did read that samples had been taken on the spot for researches. Okay, so the asterisk says that a check for radioactivity of appropriate samples was arranged by Sheriff Taylor shortly after his investigation. The results were negative. On December 17th, 1968, Philip Johnson, associate professor of radiology at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and director of nuclear medicine, Presbyterian Hospital, New York City, reported that the specimens collected by Miss Baldwin were not radioactive insofar as my instrumentation can determine. Each sample was exposed to a 2-in scintillation crystal with flat field collimator and pulse height analyzer. Okay. All right. All just pretty standard stuff. By varying the setting on the analyzer, the crystal was made sensitive to gamma photons in the energy range of 30 kevs to 1 MeV. No activity above background levels was observed. I did not test alpha particle radiation, nor for low energy beta radiation since I do not have the proper equipment. Well, shame on you. All right. Dr. Johnson, I would have expected you would have at least tested for, the low energy beta radiation, but you are forgiven. We carry on. Sheriff Taylor's report. So this is Sheriff Taylor who went up to meet Mr. Wilcox. Miss Baldwin contacted the sheriff's office, Tioga County, Owego, New York, on April 29, 1964, and on May 1st, Gary Wilcox was visited by Officer George Williams. He reported the following. Traveled to Newark Valley and contacted Priscilla Baldwin on matter pertinent to this complaint. We drove to farm of, again, I'm going to omit a lot of the thes here. It seems like people just, were in a hurry. We drove to farm of Gary Wilcox. His farm is off the Wilson Creek Road. The second place on the left side on the Davis Hollow Road. Gary was milking his cows at the time of our arrival, which was about 4:15 p.m. He stated that he milks some of his heavy milkers 3 times a day. All right. This, of course, would cause him to lose some sleep. The text of his statement concerning the unidentified object is contained in statement which is made a part of this file. He admitted that he drank a little, but that he was not drinking at the time of his reported incident. He also stated that he had some marital difficulty, but this did not encourage him to drink any more than he had been accustomed. This man does not appear to be unstable or mentally disturbed in any way. His eyes are slightly different in appearance from the average person, but it is believed that it is more of a physical characteristic than it is a mental affliction. Okay, I didn't realize that the shape of someone's eyes was directly linked to mental faculty. He is a hard worker. The complainant, in this case, says that she has no reason to doubt him. We, complainant and myself, walked to the top of the hill where this quote-unquote spaceship was reported to have landed or hovered. This hill is northeast of the farm buildings, and there is an old abandoned refrigerator at the top of the hill, which was reported to be physically situated about 20 feet from where the spaceship had been. We checked the area, particularly for red-colored dust and impressions on the ground. This was about a week after the reported incident, and there had been considerable rain during this time. The only thing unusual noted at this time was that the ground where the ship was reportedly hovering was damp. This could have been caused by a spring or ground formation. The ground surrounding the area was comparatively dry. There was no evidence of red dust. This would have been washed away anyway. Did not look too close for any evidence of digging at this time, as we were not advised until later that the individuals of questionable origin had been holding trays of sod. This, Gary believed, had been samples of the soil. He stated that the sod had grass or vegetation on top. In event that samples had been removed from his property in this area, it would be comparatively simple to relocate or to locate the place of digging. Even at this late date, it might be possible to locate evidence of digging in the grassy area on top of this hill. We continued to look around for a while and then returned to the barn. Hey, congratulations on being thorough here. I do enjoy this police officer's gumption to follow up on such a report. Normally a lot of this would have just been flippantly sort of hand-wavingly tossed aside, but the officer in question here did feel like there was merit to at least looking into this, so kudos. Officer Williams then incorporated Miss Baldwin's notes into the official record as reported above. His next entry was as follows. May 1, 1964. Upon checking the area with complainant Priscilla Baldwin, it was noted that there was one set of tractor tracks near the scene of the reported incident. Gary stated that the first time he went up the hill, he stopped the tractor about 100 yards from the top of the hill where the ship was reportedly parked. And then he dismounted and walked the remainder of the hill to the top. Gary then stated that he returned later that day and dropped off a bag of fertilizer at the site. He then stated that he again drove the tractor to the top with complainant Priscilla Baldwin to show her the spot this incident reportedly occurred. If this was the case, there should be 2 sets of tractor tracks near the site. 1 set when he brought the bag of fertilizer to the spot, and 1 set when he transported the complainant to the site. There was only 1 set of tracks noted. It isn't likely that the tractor could get to this area without making some tracks, even if the ground were dry, because of the incline is great. Well, I mean, that's a big piece of evidence right there. I mean, this goes against what he said. You know, if he said, I went up there and I saw aliens and then took her up and there was no tractor tracks prior, I mean, that's cause for doubt in my book. The following statements and diagram by Mr. Wilcox, see Figure 2, were obtained by Sheriff Taylor and Officer Williams on May 1st. So this is when, at 7 p.m., Gary goes to the sheriff's office and decides to cooperate and give them a statement. Again, I don't see why Gary would do any of this unless he had some type of psychotic break. It just seems really out of character for a guy who just wants to be left alone on his farm. I, Gary Thelbert Wilcox. Thelbert, huh? All right, probably didn't want that public. I, Gary Thelbert Wilcox, say that I am 28 years of age on the 7th day of this month, having been born May 7, 1936, at Endicott, New York. I live at Road No. 1, Newark Valley, New York, with my wife, Judith Linda. I am self-employed as a dairy farmer. I graduated from Newark Valley Central School in 1954. At about 10 o'clock in the morning last Friday, the 24th of April, 1964, I was spreading manure with my manure spreader, as one does, on one of my fields located east of my house. My house is the second house on the left on Davis Hollow Road, which runs off Wilson Creek Road out of Newark Valley. Okay. So first off, Figure 2, this is really interesting. This is the occupants and the UFO. Not an artist, this guy, really. Left out a few facial features here. Hopefully he gets into some of the description. The weather was clear and the sun was shining. The ground was dry. I glanced up at the hill from the field I was working on and noticed a shiny object on top of the hill. I thought at the time that it was the abandoned refrigerator that I knew was up there. After again glancing, I noticed that the object did not seem to be the refrigerator, but that this was something else. Then, I started driving the tractor with the same manure spreader up the hill toward the object. The distance from the bottom of the hill where I first noticed the object to the top of the hill where it appeared is about 800 yards. While I was driving up the hill toward the object and about 100 yards from it, this is when I thought it was a wing fuel tank from an airplane. I wasn't scared or anything. I parked the tractor at this point and then walked the remaining 100 yards to the object. The first thing I noticed is that it was off the ground. It was a little bigger than a car in length. It was an oblong shape, something like an egg. There were no seams, rivets, or anything like that. It was completely smooth. It was aluminum colored. I touched the thing, and the metal was harder than aluminum, and it did not move. I don't know whether it was on legs or hovering in the air. It was about 20 feet in length, 4 feet high, and 15 or 16 feet wide. That's an interesting thing. 4 feet high is wild if these creatures are 4 to 4.5 feet tall, unless this craft goes vertically and they're just kind of like in these little stasis pods, maybe laying down. Who knows? While I was feeling it, there was no vibration or sound, and it was not hot or anything. While I was touching it, 2 small men, about 4 feet high, came out from under the tank object. I don't know where they came from. Each of them was carrying a tray about a foot square. The tray looked like it was made of the same stuff the ship was made of. Inside the tray was what appeared to be sod. I was standing about a foot away from the ship. I will refer to this object as a ship from now on. I first thought it to be a tank. The 2 little men started walking toward me from under the ship. They stopped about 1 yard away from me. Then it sounded like one of them spoke and said, "Don't be alarmed. We have spoken to people before." Their voices did not sound like a voice I could describe. I could understand what was said, but cannot tell whether they were speaking English or not. One of the men was standing in rear of the other. I could see that both of these 4-foot-high men had arms and legs the same as us. I couldn't tell whether they had feet or hands the same as us. They were quite broad for such short persons or individuals. I could not distinguish whether they had shoulders or not. They seemed to just go straight down. They had no face, such as eyes, ears, nose, mouth, or hair. The voice seemed to be coming from about them rather than from either of them. There was a voice, but I don't know where it was coming from insofar as their body was concerned. They seemed to have a sort of suit on that covered where the head would normally be located all the way down. When they raised their arms, you could see a wrinkle where their elbow would be located. The color of this completely smooth coverall type suit was whitish aluminum tint color. There was no evidence of hair. There were no seams or stitches, pockets. The only thing I noticed was the wrinkle when they moved their arms at the elbow. They said, "We are from what you know as the planet Mars." All right, we're dealing with Martians. They then asked me what I was doing. I told them what I was doing was spreading manure. They asked me to explain what this was in more or less detail. They seemed interested in what this manure did. After I told them what it was and where it came from, they asked what else I made stuff grow with it. That's when I told them about the lime and fertilizer. They did not say anything about the lime, but were interested in the fertilizer. I told them it was made of bones from dead animals. During the time I was explaining to them the function of fertilizer, they asked if they could have some. I told them that I would have to go down to my barn and get some. Then one spoke up, said that they were traveling this hemisphere. I don't know which one it was, as I've said before. The voice seemed to come from the front one, the one closest to me. I then asked them if I could go. They then said that they could only come here on Earth every 2 years. Their conversation seemed to shift rapidly from one subject to another. That's interesting. Just little ADD aliens. They mentioned that we should not send people out into space. They said that they have watched us. They said that we could not survive there at Mars and that they could not survive here on Earth. They also said that they got stuff out of the air to live on and that they were here to see what they could learn about our organic material because they felt that the Earth and Mars, plus some other planets, might be changed around. They said there was a difference in the gravity pull and that there was a change taking place. They said they did not fly near cities because the fumes or stuff in the air affected the flight of their ship, that they tried to stay where the air was pure. They seemed to know more about planets, air, and all that kind of stuff, but they did not seem to know much about our agriculture. They also said that our people that had entered into space would not survive over a year. They then walked back onto the ship and disappeared. They ducked a little bit when they went under it. The ship then seemed to hover. I heard a noise that sounded like a car motor idling. It was not loud. Then it just took off slowly forward above the ground in a gliding manner and flew over the valley in the direction of Sokolowski's barn and disappeared into the air after it was about 150 feet away. There was no heat, blasting, wind, dust, noise, other than the idling sound, light, or anything else left behind when the ship took off. Okay. That's interesting. It's weird that they would know about like space and all this stuff, but not know anything about agriculture and then happen upon, a farmer to give them some information. This whole thing falls into my system theory as well, that maybe you're just interacting with some type of drone that is taking, samples from this biome and injecting it into perhaps another exoplanet that they are occupying elsewhere, and that we're just interchanging, life forms and agriculture and all sorts of elements between these planets to keep them going. Far-fetched idea, I am aware, but here we are, right? They did not try to harm me in any way, and there was nothing with them that looked like a weapon. They did not raise or lower their voice. It was the same throughout the conversation. They did most of the talking. After they left, I drove back home and called my mother on the phone. I told her the highlights of seeing this object. I then milked the cows and did some other chores. I went back up the hill with a load of manure about 4:30 p.m. and put a bag of fertilizer on the spreader. When I got back to the top of the hill where the ship had been, I dropped the bag of fertilizer to the ground and left it. The next morning, I went back up on the hill and noticed the bag of fertilizer was gone. I have read this statement, and it is true. I realize that the incident described above is unusual, but I do certify that it is a true and accurate account of what actually happened. Signed, Gary Wilcox, and witnesses George Williams and Paul Taylor. So again, I mean, the Officer Williams here, who did his investigation, does bring up a fair point that there was only one set of tractor tracks leading up to the alleged encounter. You know, for me, that is a big thing. Let's see if he addresses that, if they address that at all. It's a really interesting thing. I would love to hear his take on that. But alas, we go into the psychiatric study and evaluation of Mr. Wilcox. On October 18th, 1968, psychiatric examination of Gary Wilcox in his home corroborated all the salient features mentioned in Miss Baldwin's and Sheriff Taylor's reports. At the same time of the psychiatric study, Mr. Wilcox was no longer a farmer, but a highly skilled mechanic. He was respected by his employer and had received several promotions. He had never had any UFO, psychic, or other very unusual experiences before, nor has he since. Although he could not recall any details, he mentioned that a neighbor told him about a close-range UFO experience at the approximate time of his episode. And there's an asterisk here. It says, although this could not be confirmed via correspondence with the deceased neighbor's wife, she reported that a respected gentleman of Berkshire, New York, was out in his field that day and saw something that was unexplainable. Also in a letter to the author, Walter Stevens recalled that he and a friend saw a possible UFO that almost blinded us for a moment on April 18th, 1964 on Highway 38. Also, Mr. Kobylarz remembered how one or two people saw something, UFOs, near Gary Wilcox's farm that day. So, all right. Circumstantial evidence, but, worth mentioning. Mr. Wilcox's attitude was open and cooperative, and produced no material that conflicted with the previous reports. He spoke in a polite, refined manner, and his answers had a literalness about them. There was no tendency towards expansiveness or embellishment. He was quite reserved. He was sure that he had seen only 2 occupants of the UFO, and that at one time he was approximately 10 feet distant from one of them. He felt he could judge their height quite accurately because he is 6 feet tall. When asked about his initial reaction to the supposed ufonauts, he said, "I was laughing. I thought it was the candid camera, somebody pulling a gag or something." Wilcox had no past history for neonatal disturbances, serious illness in the formative years, neurotic character traits, dissociative or amnestic experiences, fugues, sociopathic behavior, school problems, head injury, encephalopathy, surgery, or any kind of aberrant behavior. He had never been hospitalized, and he did not have a family physician. Review of all his bodily systems revealed no disease stigmata. He was a good student in school and had 1 semester in college. He spent 3 years in the Army, being stationed in Germany. He was a sergeant in the engineers and received an honorable discharge. So here there's an asterisk beside his school stuff. It says this was verified by the parents of 2 former schoolmates and longtime friends. Mr. Kobylarz said, a well-liked kid, modest and never a braggart. Of a reliable and hardworking family, he knew it wasn't a mirage because he had his hand on it, on the UFO. They are very fine people. My brother has known his people for 40 years. Mrs. Beale wrote, Philip, her son, knows him. I was in his graduate school and says he is an honest person who wouldn't concoct a cock and bull story just to get publicity. There's another asterisk here which says, in regards to his service in Germany, says that when Mr. Kobylarz talked with Gary Wilcox, he asked if the UFO occupants were Russian. Wilcox said that they were not, and they had no accent. He was familiar with many foreign accents from his army service in Germany. And this is also echoed in his telephone interview. He says that he either spoke or heard German and Russian quite a bit, and it did not sound like that at all. So the oldest of 4 siblings, Gary Wilcox, has a sister, Sandra, who is 2 years younger, and 2 brothers, Barry and Floyd, who are 4 and 7 years younger. There was no family history of mental illness, sociopathic behavior, such as lying, stealing, cheating, truancy, fire setting, delinquency, drug usage, alcoholism, etc., or difficulties with the law. He is of old American stock, and his family has an excellent reputation in the community. Gary Wilcox has always enjoyed good health, and has rarely consulted physicians. He seldom dreamed and could not recall any particular dream, including one about his UFO experience. So just a simple guy, just a mild-mannered farm boy, veteran, upstanding citizen, good classmate, nothing, no sign of crazy whatsoever. Which makes this even more perplexing, because there is contradicting evidence. And yet, none of it points to him, having some type of secret hidden agenda. Direct examination revealed him to be a tall, handsome, intelligent-appearing man, see Figure 3, who became restless and fidgety when describing his encounter with the alleged UFO occupants. There was no evidence for any undue preoccupations, trends of thought, pathological thinking, or inappropriate effect. Within 1 hour after the UFO experience, Wilcox telephoned his mother, and then the other members of his family quickly learned about it. Direct and telephone interviews with his mother and his 2 brothers confirmed this. So the asterisk here says Gary Wilcox had no knowledge of Sergeant Lonnie Zamora's UFO occupant experience. Okay, interesting. Until shortly before May 11th, when he brought an undated news clipping from his father to Sheriff Paul Taylor. Dad told me about it, came up to the house with it, the clipping, about a week or so later after Newark Valley UFO episode. It is of interest that many features of the Newark Valley and the Socorro experiences are similar. I think that is interesting as well. No one in his family had ever experienced anything like this before. Wilcox had no previous particular interest in UFOs or any other kind of exotic subject. His reading was limited to newspapers and magazines like Look, Life, and the Reader's Digest. Wilcox and the other members of his family gave no history for any unusual paranormal phenomena before or after this episode. He gave no history for unusual harassment since the episode. Wilcox had never been hypnotized. However, he was annoyed by various eccentrics and curiosity seekers who sought him out or ridiculed him. He was particularly irritated by one newspaper article that falsely stated he was being treated in a hospital in New York City for radiation burns. Although hardly affluent, Wilcox, according to his brother Floyd, turned down a considerable sum of money offered by a leading national magazine for the publication rights to his story. He also refused payments for lectures about his experience. He graciously consented to psychiatric study and freely gave permission for publication of his story in a scientific journal with the understanding that his current address would not be revealed. That is, to me, one of the most important pieces of information here. We're not dealing with some type of UFO grifter. He's not doing any lectures, not selling a book, not doing any of that stuff. He had something happen. This is what happened. Back to work. Got to milk the cows, In an interview, Gary Wilcox's second wife, married for 2 years and after the UFO episode, confirming the foregoing UFO information. She described her husband as a quiet family man, conscientious, and doesn't easily lose his temper. Yet he has a sense of humor. He did not use alcohol or tobacco and has always enjoyed excellent health. There's an asterisk here. At the time of the UFO incident, he had not been under the influence of alcohol. During his farming years, he used alcohol only infrequently and sparingly. He occasionally attends the Baptist church. Questions pertaining to Gary Wilcox's past life and the personal nuances of his marriages, and then the asterisk here says his first marriage, which lasted only a short time, was terminated under amiable conditions because of a lack of harmony of interests. His marriages elicited no evidence for any disrupting psychopathology, psychosomatic reactions, dishonesty, or proclivity for playing practical jokes or hoaxes. Mr. Wilcox was characterized as a serious, truthful, hardworking man who had little time for frivolity. Gotta milk those cows, no time for jokes. There was never any suggestion of jealousy or unfounded suspiciousness. His chief pleasure seemed to be playing with his children. 2 by his second wife, and 4 adoptive children from his second wife's first marriage. Study of Gary Wilcox's and his wife's answers to Cornell Medical Index Health Questionnaire, Rotter Incomplete Sentences Test, and the computer-automated Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory revealed answers consistent with physical and emotional health. On the MMPI, a configural search for positive traits and strengths showed correlations for describing the subject as compliant, methodical, orderly, socially reserved, and sincere. Well, there you have it. This guy checks out. He's telling what he seems to be the truth. We can at least say that. He deems this happened, and people believe him. All right? Discussion and summary. So although single witness UFO experiences, that's right there. That's probably why Blue Book never looked into it, actually. We looked at the Project Blue Book guidelines, and it was one of the major things was they would never look into single UFO witness encounters. Other than Joe Simonton, it had a bit of an exception there because there were other sightings, but, also involved physical evidence. This one did not. Although single witness UFO experiences have obvious drawbacks, Gary Wilcox's report is exceptional because of his unusually healthy background. During and after the purported incident, the rarity of such close-range UFO occupant encounters, and the difficulty and need for recording all data that might contribute to this multifaceted problem. Despite some explainable discrepancies, such as Officer Williams' observation that there was only one set of tractor tracks instead of two, Wilcox's account was essentially unchanged. It should again be stressed that Gary Wilcox told his mother and other members of his family shortly after the incident, and that it was not until several days later that he learned of the Socorro, New Mexico episode involving Officer Lonnie Zamora. It is odd that the widely reported and studied account of Lonnie Zamora occurred on the same day and approximately 8 hours earlier than Gary Wilcox had his experience. Recently, the Newark Valley incident has received renewed attention. The independent studies of Walter N. Webb, the NICAP advisor, and his associates, and the NICAP file on the Newark Valley case, provided detailed data and supplement and coincide with the material reported here. Should future investigations confirm the reality of such experiences, for what actually seemed to happen, or some new and strange kind of mental or psychic influence, or the converse, the discovery of some new and hitherto recognized type of psychopathology, the psychiatric studies would still have significance. The psychiatric studies, would still have significance. I agree with this. This is something that I was on the phone with Jesse Michaels earlier, and we were talking about the abduction phenomenon as a whole and how, should the abduction phenomenon be completely categorized as a mental event in some capacity, some type of psychological effect that the human mind goes through. The fact that there are thousands, and I mean tens of thousands of people who claim abduction, and many of them also claim not only the same type of beings, the same type of craft, but also the same type of procedures being done to them and the same messages being delivered to them. I think that would be just as important as aliens existing, knowing that there is some type of psychological pandemic that is sweeping the globe and providing people with these mass hallucinations. I think that is just as significant as an alien. Well, maybe not as significant, but equally as interesting. What's going on here? If all these people are just all in cahoots or they're all, like I said, hallucinating the same thing or having the exact same dreams and in these dreams having the same experience. It seems so far-fetched. It seems so much easier on the Occam's razor to be like, no, it's aliens. I don't know. Just me? Maybe not. Maybe you disagree. Study of the UFO occupant problem is still at an early explorative qualitative stage. Had circumstances permitted, it would have been desirable to have had additional procedures such as a physical and neurological examination, an electroencephalogram, polygraphic studies, hypnotic trance, laboratory, and some complete psychometric evaluations. It is unfortunate that it was not possible at the time of this report in 1969 to have traced out more completely the various collateral leads as suggested by the situations of Kobylarz, Stevens, and McPherson. I agree. Hypnotic regression would have been great. Polygraph, just, lie detector. But does that really get us anywhere? You look at Travis Walton when all 7 of these gentlemen passed a lie detector test. Betty Hill also passed a lie detector test. Is that, perhaps it does increase the percentage of conviction of these cases being true, but it certainly doesn't prove them true. As has been pointed out by Keel, who has had much experience with alleged contactees, the interpretation of what was supposed to have happened is an entirely open question. For example, that the occupants said they came from Mars does not mean that they did come from Mars. There's an asterisk here that says it should be noted that Peter Gilman called attention to unusual compatibility between what Martians told Gary Wilcox and what Dr. Emanuel Velikowski has theorized. Everything that the contactees, or ufonauts, reputably said should be critically analyzed from many points of view: truthfulness, purposely implanted lies, distorted propaganda, material that could be communicated and understood only by one of Gary Wilcox's psychodynamic makeup, possibly of telepathy, and so forth. Unfortunately, the facts do not justify much speculation in this regard. I agree with that as well. But yes, it could be aliens just psyoping people or, what have you. Or maybe it's humans in these suits. These were suits. Maybe these were tiny people. I don't know. Who knows? It would be most unusual, however, for Gary Wilcox to concoct such a fantastic story without some clues for this from his psychiatric examination or from interviews with his friends, acquaintances, and family. It should be stressed that as a down-to-earth person, a highly skilled machinist with a rather literal frame of mind, Wilcox never showed any unusual interest in UFOs or space. He had no undue preoccupation with abstruse, esoteric matters, quasi-religious cults, or offbeat stories before or since the episode. The ufonauts' prophecy of the death in space of some astronauts was not completely fulfilled, as stated. However, it is of interest that Virgil A. Grissom, along with Edward H. White and Roger B. Chaffee, died in the tragic Apollo capsule fire on January 27, 1967. Although not specifically named by the ufonauts, Russian astronaut Vladimir Komarov was the first man known to have been killed in actual spaceflight when his capsule plunged to Earth under unopened parachutes, April 24th, same date, 1967, exactly 3 years after the prophecy. There's an asterisk here, talks about Komarov, how he was scheduled to orbit for at least 5 days, but according to London newspaperman, he returned to Earth after 24 hours. Recording of radio transmissions indicates that the spacecraft's crew had seen something strange and inexplicable in orbit, something that terrified them so much that they made a hasty and unscheduled descent from space. It may be proper to mention here that Komarov, through an interpreter, told the world-famous telepathist Joseph Dunninger during a banquet at Benjamin Franklin Hotel at the Seattle World's Fair 1962 that he, Komarov, had observed during spaceflight strange phantasms, odd things that appeared before his eyes. He was sure that his mind was not playing tricks on him and that it was not an illusion. Dunninger was impressed with Komarov's openness. Although there was a language barrier, Dunninger recalled how he also tried a telepathic stunt with Komarov. I never got an analysis of what I drew on my pad, something that I saw in my mind's mirror. However, according to Komarov's reaction and that of the interpreter, Dunninger succeeded. The author clearly recalled this unusual interview because Dunninger had given him an autographed photograph of Komarov and Dunninger in May 1965. It may also be noted here that the reporter Sandham quoted observations of strange space objects by American astronauts, the NBC-monitored spaceflight of Gordon Cooper, May 15, 1963, of 2 Edward White and James McDivitt, June 1965, and 3 of James Lovell and Frank Borman, December 1965. Another astronaut sighting, according to the UFO investigator, is that of Charles Conrad in September 1966. Okay, so we see a lot of astronauts seeing a lot of things. This doesn't necessarily corroborate the prophecy that was given to Mr. Wilcox by the beings, however. It would be of interest, since many contactee experiences allege telepathic communications, to have a proven eminent telepathist work with them and study what impressions, telepathic thoughts, might be received. It is not far-fetched that someone like Dunninger, who has amazed the world for more than 50 years with his extraordinary mental abilities, and who has also successfully used his talents to aid the police in solutions of crimes and physicians in the treatments of diseases, might be able to recall material forgotten by the contactee. Such repressed data, accessible to a paragnost, might provide further clues in the study of such cases. All right, I'm going to draw the line right there. Sounds to me like someone is a magician. Maybe just me. All right, maybe he is a telepathist. Telepathist is a wild thing to put on your resume. Okay. Keel has documented some unusual instances of successful prophecy in connections with UFOs, however. As described elsewhere, nothing in the medical aspects of a possible human UFO occupant experience is applicable to the situation of Gary Wilcox. As in the examples of Miss Stickler and Mrs. Caro, Wilcox also had no mental disturbance, no history of being hypnotized, no suggestion of paranoid thinking, no hints of specific psychopathology, and no cultural, religious-like determinants that could account for his experience. Although inexplicable, there is much in Gary Wilcox's encounter with the UFO and its occupants that sounds like data obtained from other worldwide sources. There might be considerable value in psychiatric study of many more contactee experiences. It is ironic that the billions are spent to put men on the moon in order to probe the secrets of space, yet apparently little attention is paid to the possibility that forms of life, ufonauts, from somewhere in the universe, possibly outer space, may have already landed on Earth. In summary, Gary Wilcox, almost 28 years old and a farmer of Newark Valley, New York, claimed he had a close-range experience with a UFO and two of its occupants. From psychiatric evaluation of Wilcox and interviews with various members of his family, neighbors, and friends, it would seem that he is a truthful person with no emotional illness and that his experience was real, even though the interpretation of his encounter is a complicated and uncertain matter. The author thanks Gary Wilcox and the many other people mentioned and unmentioned in this study for their indispensable help. That wraps up the case of Gary Wilcox. Man, that's an interesting one. So I had not heard about Gary Wilcox prior to this. I didn't know that it was a thing. I didn't know that this had happened to him at the exact same time, almost, of the encounter in Socorro, New Mexico. It is vexing to think that he is telling the truth when there is such a, in my opinion, blatant piece of evidence that negates the idea of him going up there with his tractor multiple times. I think that is, unless he took a different way up, unless something else, maybe that feeling of guilt is what prevented Gary from following the sheriff up there in the first place. Maybe had Gary gone up that hill with the sheriff, he'd be perhaps pointing out the fact that there's only one track there. Maybe we'd get some more answers. I wish they would have brought that up to him. Unfortunate that they did not, because that one really is like a thorn in my side. But other than that, it is compelling. Put that aside, all right? Maybe there's a mishap. Maybe it's a different trail. Maybe he took the exact same trail up than he did. You know, he just like rolled in the same tracks, which, I mean, come on. That's a possibility, especially if it's muddy. Putting all that aside, it is pretty compelling. If this is a lie and a sham or some type of hoax or weird joke, you know, but again, like, I mean, I can't see a reason why. The only thing I can kind of, you know, maybe as a farmer, he was kind of against new tech, being, you know, from the earth, being somebody who has their hands in soil and works with cattle and drives tractors. Maybe all this talk about going to space. It's 1964. They were talking about they were going to space and they were talking about going to the moon and all this stuff. Maybe that got under his skin and maybe he's like, hey, let's focus on what's going on here. Interesting that they took an interest to the things that he was interested in. And he was like, no, they asked me about all this stuff that I love, you know, and I told them it's, you know, awesome. And they liked it too. And I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. None of that seems like a good reason to go to a police station and tell them an insane confabulation. None of that seems to add up for me. Coupled with the fact that he's completely sane, I don't know what else to say. I'm 50-50 on this one. Let me know what you guys think. My conviction level is at a neutral standstill. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Gary Wilcox case. I want to thank you guys for watching this episode. You know, we like to cover cold cases here, cases that maybe have flown under the radar, so to speak. Last week, if you haven't checked it out, I did a road trip to New Hampshire with my buddy Nelson Dellis, and we traced the Betty and Barney Hill route on the same date, on the same time as was their abduction, and that was really interesting. That video is also flown under the radar, but if you guys want to check it out, I put a lot of work into it. It is objectively really good. I enjoyed making that quite a bit, and I also got to interview Kathleen Martin, an expert on her Aunt Betty Hill's case. Folks, that about wraps it up for today. We got a really special guest next week, and I cannot wait to share that with you. If you're a member, you already know what's up. If you're an intern, you got the skinny already. But for the rest of you, you're going to have to wait and see. Have an awesome day, and we'll see you on the next video. Peace and love.